The sprawling landscape of North Texas serves as a backdrop for communities that are rapidly transforming, where the encroaching sprawl of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex meets the quiet pastoral endurance of rural Johnson County. Godley, Texas is one such place, a town defined by its small population and open spaces, sitting just south of Fort Worth. It is a community where Friday night lights and weekend gatherings anchor the social calendar, and where the boundaries between small-town intimacy and big city influence often blur. In the spring of 2023, the region was waking up from winter, the air filling with the humidity and anticipation characteristic of April in the South. This is the season of milestones for young people, a time marked by proms, graduations, and the frantic electric energy of impending summer. It was within this specific atmospheric charge that two 20-year-old men, Jaden Moblin and Spencer Orlando Gilbert II, were living their separate lives, unaware that their trajectories were about to collide violently on a warm spring night. Jaden Moblin was 20 years old, an age that sits precariously between the dependence of adolescence and the full responsibilities of adulthood. Friends and family knew him as a young man with a vibrant spirit, someone who carried the optimism of youth. At 20, the world often feels expansive, filled with potential pathways and new experiences. Jaden was navigating this pivotal era, establishing his identity outside the halls of high school and finding his footing in the wider world. He was a son and a friend embedded in a social network that spanned the Fort Worth area. By all accounts, he was looking for the same things most young men his age sought: connection, celebration, and the simple joy of a weekend night out with peers. He was not looking for trouble, nor did he live his life with the hardened guard of someone expecting violence. The night of April 16th was meant to be nothing more than a social highlight, a chance to be seen and to see others, to laugh over loud music and enjoy the camaraderie of a large gathering. In stark contrast stood Spencer Orlando Gilbert II. Also 20 years old, Gilbert moved through the North Texas corridor with a different energy. While sharing the same chronological age as Moblin, Gilbert's background and choices had placed him on a more volatile path. The details of his life prior to that night suggest a familiarity with elements of danger that most young men avoid. Gilbert was not merely a passive observer of the street culture that sometimes permeates the outer rings of the city. He was an active participant. He carried himself with an attitude of defiance, a trait that would later be amplified for a digital audience of thousands. For Gilbert, a party was not just a celebration, it was a stage, an environment to assert dominance and display status. He moved toward Godley that night, not just as a guest, but as someone prepared for conflict, bringing with him a mindset that viewed perceived slights as invitations to escalate. The catalyst for their meeting was a post-prom party. In Texas, the concept of the post-prom party is a cultural institution. While the prom itself is a chaperoned event held in ballrooms and banquet halls, the after-party is often an untamed successor. These gatherings frequently take place in private residences, rented properties, or open fields, drawing crowds that far exceed the guest lists of the formal dances. They attract not only the high school seniors for whom the night is named, but also recent graduates and young adults from neighboring towns who are drawn by the gravity of a massive social event. The party in Godley was no exception, and it was designed to be the peak of the weekend, a destination for dozens of young people looking to extend the night until sunrise. Word of the gathering spread through the digital veins of social media, pinging on smartphones across Johnson and Tarrant counties. The address was shared in group chats and stories, transforming a quiet residence into a beacon for the area's youth. The allure of such a party lies in its unpredictability. It is a space where social hierarchies are reconfirmed, where romances begin, and where the energy of the crowd dictates the mood. For Jaden Moblin, the invitation was a green light for a good time. He prepared for the night with the casual confidence of someone expecting to be among friends. The drive to Godley would have been filled with music and conversation, the anticipation building as he and his group got closer to the destination. Simultaneously, Spencer Gilbert was making his way to the same location. The convergence of these two distinct lives was facilitated by the open nature of the party. With approximately 50 to 60 young people expected to attend, the crowd would be dense enough to offer anonymity, but small enough to force interaction. The venue, a private residence, was ill-equipped to handle the security needs of such a mix. Unlike a club or a school-sponsored event, there were no metal detectors, no security guards patting down guests at the door, and no regulated entry points. It was an environment reliant on the social contract of its attendees, an assumption that everyone was there for the same peaceful purpose. As the night of April 15th bled into the early morning hours of April 16th, the atmosphere in Godley shifted. The quiet rural roads saw an influx of traffic. Headlights cut through the darkness as cars lined the streets near the party site. The bass from the music could be felt before it was heard, a thumping heartbeat drawing people toward the house. Inside and in the surrounding yard, the air was thick with smoke, perfume, and the noise of 50 conversations competing for dominance. Jaden Moblin arrived and integrated into the flow of the party, likely greeting acquaintances and finding his spot within the ecosystem of the gathering. He was there to exist in the moment, to celebrate the weekend. Spencer Gilbert arrived with a different burden. He entered the space carrying a firearm, and a decision that fundamentally altered the safety equation for everyone present. In the context of a crowded house party, the presence of a gun transforms the dynamic from a social gathering into a potential crime scene waiting for a trigger. Gilbert's presence was a variable that the other guests, including Moblin, could not have accounted for. As the music played and the crowd swelled, the physical proximity of the attendees increased. Shoulders brushed against shoulders, and voices raised to be heard over the din, and the chaotic energy of the post-prom celebration reached its zenith. The stage was set in a way that is tragically common in modern American crime narratives. You had a location removed from immediate police oversight, a crowd of young adults fueled by the excitement of the night and the introduction of a deadly weapon into a volatile social mix. Jaden Moblin stood on one side of this equation, representing the unsuspecting victim, a young man with a future he assumed was guaranteed. Spencer Gilbert stood on the other, representing the aggressor, a young man who had already decided that lethal force was an acceptable option for dispute resolution. The distance between them closed not over years or months, but in the span of minutes as they moved through the same crowded rooms in Godley. The celebration was in full swing, the laughter and music masking the tension that was quietly unspooling in the shadows, leading inexorably toward a confrontation that would shatter the spring night. Gilbert represented the catalyst, a variable introduced into an environment that was already saturated with adrenaline and adolescent bravado. As the clock ticked past midnight, transitioning April 15th into the early hours of April 16th, the residence in Godley became a microcosm of unchecked aggression disguised as celebration. The location itself played a critical role in the unfolding disaster. Godley is a small community in Johnson County, typically characterized by its rural quietude and distance from the high-velocity crime often associated with major metropolitan centers like Houston or Dallas. On this night, however, the isolation of the venue worked against the safety of those in attendance. The house was far enough removed from the immediate patrol routes of law enforcement to create a false sense of immunity among the guests, yet accessible enough to draw a diverse crowd that extended beyond the immediate circle of graduating seniors. The convergence of approximately 50 teenagers and young adults created a density that made physical contact inevitable and personal space non-existent. The architecture of a standard residential home is ill-equipped to handle the dynamics of a crowd of that size, particularly when that crowd is fueled by the post-event high of a senior prom. In the living areas, the kitchen, and the backyard, social circles overlapped and clashed. The air grew thick with the humidity of the Texas spring mixed with the heat of dozens of bodies moving in confined spaces. The auditory landscape was a wall of noise, thumping bass from speakers, shouting over the music to be heard, and the distinct, sharp laughter that often masks nervousness or aggression. This was not a homogeneous group of friends. The nature of a post-prom party often involves a loosening of the guest list. While the core attendees were likely students celebrating a milestone, the presence of 20-year-olds like Spencer Gilbert and Jaden Moblin shifted the demographic reality. They were legally adults operating within a social sphere dominated by younger peers. This age gap, while only a matter of a few years, introduced a different level of life experience and street-level conditioning into the mix. For individuals like Gilbert, the party was not merely a celebration of academic achievement. It was a stage for social dominance. The atmosphere at the residence began to curdle as the night deepened. Witnesses later described a palpable shift in the energy, a transition from chaotic joy to something sharper and more predatory. In environments like this, eye contact can be misinterpreted, and accidental bumps in a crowded hallway can be perceived as intentional slights. The presence of alcohol or other substances, common in such unsupervised settings, likely eroded inhibitions and impaired judgment, stripping away the social guardrails that typically prevent verbal disputes from becoming physical. The noise level meant that communication was fragmented, relying on gestures and posturing rather than dialogue. Spencer Gilbert navigated this space with a concealed lethality. He was already a felon, a status that legally prohibited him from possessing a firearm, yet he had brought a gun into the crowded house. The weapon was not just a tool for protection. In the context of his later behavior on social media, it suggests a mindset prepared for, if not seeking, confrontation. A firearm in a crowded room changes the physics of a conflict. It turns a potential fistfight into a life-or-death scenario. Gilbert's presence introduced a silent threat that most attendees were unaware of until it was too late. He moved through the party carrying the capacity for instant violence, a secret that emboldened his interactions and likely influenced his demeanor. Jaden Moblin, also 20, was navigating the same crowded rooms. The specific prior relationship between Gilbert and Moblin, if any, was less relevant than their proximity in that volatility. In a room of 50 people, the geography of the party forced them into the same orbit. The underlying tensions were not necessarily about deep-seated feuds, but about the immediate friction of the moment, territory, respect, and the fragile egos of young men performing masculinity in front of an audience. The post-prom label implies a sense of finality, a last hurrah before the divergence of graduation, but for the older attendees, it was simply another Saturday night where status had to be maintained. As the celebration reached its peak, the structural integrity of the social order began to fracture. The distinct cliques that had formed early in the evening began to dissolve into a more fluid and dangerous mixture. The noise, once a unifying rhythm for dancing, became a chaotic backdrop that made de-escalation impossible. If words were exchanged, they were lost in the din. Warnings, if they were issued, went unheard. The house in Godley had become a pressure cooker with a sealed lid. The isolation that had made the party possible now meant that help was miles away. The sensory overload of the environment contributed to a tunnel vision among the guests. Flashing lights, the haze of the room, and the sheer volume of sensory input meant that few people were paying attention to the specific movements of Spencer Gilbert until the dynamic shifted aggressively. He was not an anonymous face in the crowd. His actions were becoming conspicuous. The way a person carries themselves when they are armed often differs from the way an unarmed person moves. There is a guarding of the person, a specific arrogance, or a hypervigilance. In the tightly packed rooms, this body language spoke volumes to those who knew what to look for, creating pockets of unease that rippled outward. By the time the timeline approached the critical moment, the party had effectively split into two realities: the oblivious majority continuing to celebrate, and the smaller subset of individuals near the epicenter of the rising tension who realized that the vibe had turned dark. The laughter in certain corners of the house died down, replaced by the hushed whispers of onlookers sensing a disturbance. The collective attention of the room began to magnetize toward the friction point. It is a phenomenon often seen in public disturbances, the sudden clearing of a circle, or the instinctive retreat of the bystanders, leaving the combatants isolated in the center. The underlying tension was not merely about two individuals, it was about the collision of two worlds. The high school world of prom, with its formal wear and structured expectations, was crashing into the reality of adult consequences brought by Gilbert and Moblin. The innocence of the event was being eroded minute by minute. The attendees were no longer students. They were witnesses in waiting. The music continued to play, providing a jarring, upbeat soundtrack to a situation that was rapidly deteriorating. In the final minutes before the eruption of violence, the spatial dynamics of the house played a crucial role. Confined hallways or a crowded living room offer no avenue for retreat. When a dispute arises in such a space, the fight-or-flight response is short-circuited. Flight is physically impossible due to the wall of bodies, leaving fight as the only perceived option. This entrapment amplifies fear and aggression. For a man like Gilbert, already armed and predisposed to criminal behavior as evidenced by his record, the feeling of being pressed or challenged in a trapped space likely accelerated his decision-making process. The converging of 50 lives at that specific coordinate in Godley was a statistical improbability that turned tragic. Had the party been broken up an hour earlier? Had the venue been different? Or had the invite list been more controlled, the trajectory might have changed. Instead, the elements aligned perfectly for disaster. The heat, the noise, the crowd, the weapon, and the personalities involved created a critical mass. The party atmosphere, initially defined by celebration, had fully metabolized into a hostile environment. The unsuspecting guests, many still in their formal attire, stood on the precipice of trauma, unaware that the young man moving among them was moments away from shattering the night. The stage was fully set, the players were in position, and the safety of the Godley countryside was about to be irrevocably breached. The heat, the noise, the claustrophobic density of bodies in the repurposed space created a sensory pressure cooker that required only a single spark to detonate. By the early morning hours of April 16th, the air inside the Godley residence was thick with humidity and the chaotic energy of 50 young adults. The celebration, initially a post-prom gathering intended to mark a milestone of youth and achievement, had curdled into something volatile. The music, once a unifying rhythm, now acted as a jarring backdrop to the rising interpersonal tensions simmering beneath the surface. In such environments, personal space is non-existent, and accidental contact, a bumped shoulder, a stepped-on sneaker, or a spilled drink can be interpreted not as a mistake, but as a challenge. The precise moment the atmosphere shifted from celebration to aggression was almost imperceptible to those on the periphery. But for those in the center of the room, the change was absolute. A disturbance rippled through the crowd. Voices were raised, cutting through the bass of the music, sharp and aggressive. The casual groupings of teenagers and young adults began to warp. The crowd instinctively pulling back to create a circle while simultaneously leaning in to witness the spectacle. It was the ancient grim choreography of a street fight, manifesting in a suburban living room. Jaden Moblin stood within this proximity. At 20 years old, he was a young man with a life still unfolding, surrounded by peers. The altercation that erupted was physical, sudden, and messy. Fists were thrown, a flurry of motion that confused the eye. In the confined space, the violence was intimate and chaotic. It was the kind of skirmish that, in previous generations or different contexts, might have resulted in bruises, torn clothing, and bruised egos, ending with separation and eventual de-escalation. However, the dynamics of conflict in this specific room were governed by a different set of rules, rules dictated by the presence of Spencer Orlando Gilbert II. Gilbert, also 20, was not merely an observer or a participant in a scuffle. He was armed. His history, marked by prior felony involvement, had not deterred him from carrying a weapon into a crowded social gathering. As the physical struggle intensified, the threshold for lethal escalation was crossed with terrifying speed. The fight did not have time to naturally resolve or be broken up by bystanders. There was no period of cooling off. The transition from a fist fight to a homicide occurred in the span of a heartbeat. Witnesses would later recall the sudden change in Gilbert's demeanor, a shift from physical posturing to cold, lethal intent. Amidst the shoving and the shouting, Gilbert reached for the firearm he had concealed. The movement was deliberate. In a room filled with unarmed partygoers, the introduction of a gun fundamentally altered the reality of the night. The weapon, a piece of steel designed solely for destruction, became the focal point of the room, though many would not realize it until the sound shattered their hearing. Gilbert raised the weapon. The distance between him and Jaden Moblin was negligible. At such close range, aim is less about precision and more about the raw intent to kill. The decision-making process, clouded by adrenaline and malice, bypassed all logic of consequences. Gilbert pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening within the enclosed walls of the home. It was not the cinematic pop often portrayed in media, but a concussive boom that physically assaulted the senses of everyone present. The noise instantly erased the music, the shouting, and the laughter. It was a singular, catastrophic event that froze time for a fraction of a second before chaos erupted. Jaden Moblin was struck. The physics of the bullet entry caused immediate, critical damage. The projectile, traveling at supersonic speed, tore through tissue and bone, delivering a kinetic shock that incapacitated him instantly. He collapsed to the floor, the sudden loss of verticality marking the end of his conscious participation in the world. The stark reality of a body falling, not from a stumble or a dance move, but from the mechanical trauma of a gunshot, triggered a primal panic in the onlookers. For the 50 young people crowded into that space, the realization of what had happened hit in waves. In those closest to the muzzle flash were stunned by the concussion and the proximity to death. Those further back heard the shot and felt the surge of the crowd before they understood the cause. The reaction was a collective, terrified convulsion. The room, previously a grid of social interactions, became a fluid mass of panic. Screams pierced the ringing silence that followed the shot. The sound was raw, the vocalization of absolute terror. The instinct for self-preservation overrode all other impulses. A stampede ensued. Young men and women, dressed in their best clothes, scrambled for the exits. They climbed over furniture, pushed through doorways, and trampled over the debris of the party in a desperate bid to escape the kill zone. The bottleneck at the doors created a crush of bodies, a terrifying claustrophobia, where the fear of being shot was compounded by the fear of being crushed. Inside the room, the scene was a tableau of horror. Jaden Moblin lay on the ground, his lifeblood beginning to pool on the floor surface, a stark crimson contrast to the mundane domestic setting. The smell of burnt gunpowder hung heavy in the stagnant air, an acrid metallic scent that burned the nostrils and signaled the presence of violence. Spencer Gilbert, having discharged the weapon, did not remain to render aid or process the gravity of his action. The act of shooting Moblin had been a choice of domination and violence. The immediate aftermath was a choice of evasion. with the gun still in his possession, the same weapon that would later appear in his digital boasts. He navigated the chaos he had created. He moved through the panic, distinct from it. While others fled in fear for their lives, Gilbert fled to preserve his freedom. He exited the Godley residence, leaving behind a scene of absolute devastation. The transition from the interior chaos to the exterior night did nothing to dampen the adrenaline coursing through his system. The cool night air of Texas contrasted sharply with the suffocating heat of the party. But the urgency remained. He made his way to his vehicle, the sounds of screaming and the distant approaching sirens beginning to fill the acoustic landscape of the neighborhood. Back inside, the panic began to settle into trauma. Friends of Jadin, those who had not fled or who had returned after the initial surge, gathered around his fallen form. The shock was total. The visual reality of the injury, the pallor spreading across his skin, and the shallow, ragged nature of his breathing communicated a grim prognosis. Desperate attempts were made to stem the bleeding, hands pressing against the wound in a futile effort to hold life inside the body. The frantic calls to 911 were disjointed, breathless pleas for help, struggling to convey the address and the nature of the emergency through the fog of hysteria. The arrival of law enforcement and emergency medical services brought a new layer of chaos to the scene. Flashing lights cut through the darkness, illuminating the tear-streaked faces of the teenagers scattered on the lawn and in the street. Paramedics moved with urgency, their equipment clattering as they rushed to the victim. Police officers, weapons drawn, swept the premises. Their shouts for compliance adding to the sensory overload. They were looking for a shooter who was already gone, a phantom who had dissipated into the night. Moblin was treated on the scene with advanced life support measures. Intubation, compression, and rapid transport protocols were initiated. He was lifted onto a stretcher, his body limp, a stark contrast to the vibrancy he had possessed only minutes prior. The ambulance sped away, sirens wailing. She carrying him toward a hospital where trauma surgeons would fight a losing battle against the devastation wrought by Gilbert's bullet. The residence in Godley was now a crime scene. Yellow tape was strung up, demarcating the boundary between the ordinary world and the site of a homicide. Evidence markers were placed on the floor, next to discarded cups, a dropped shoe, and the shell casing that had been ejected from Gilbert's gun. The party was over, replaced by the forensic deconstruction of a murder. Gilbert, meanwhile, was putting miles between himself and the consequences of his actions. He was not merely fleeing, he was transitioning into the next phase of his criminal trajectory. The panic that had gripped the other partygoers was absent in him. Instead of remorse or fear, a disturbing sense of accomplishment began to manifest. As he drove away from Godley, the adrenaline of the kill did not curdle into guilt. It calcified into arrogance. The drive was not a silent retreat. It was the beginning of a flight that would take him toward Houston, a journey during which the gravity of taking a human life would be completely ignored in favor of performative bravado. The weapon, warm from the discharge, sat near him in the vehicle. It was no longer just a tool, it was a trophy. The mindset that allowed him to pull the trigger in a crowded room was the same mindset that would soon lead him to broadcast his crime to the world. For the 50 witnesses left behind, the night of April 16th would never end. The image of the muzzle flash, the sound of the shot, and the sight of Jadin Moblin collapsing were burned into their memories. The psychological impact was immediate. Young people who had arrived expecting a night of celebration were now survivors of gun violence, carrying the invisible wounds of trauma. They gave statements to detectives, their voices shaking, trying to piece together the sequence of events that transformed a friend into a victim and a peer into a killer. The investigation began immediately. Names were offered, descriptions were matched. The identity of Spencer Orlando Gilbert II surfaced quickly. He was not a stranger to the system, and his presence at the party was verified by multiple attendees. The manhunt was initiated before the sun had fully risen. Authorities knew they were looking for an armed and dangerous individual, one who had demonstrated a casual disregard for human life in a room full of witnesses. As the ambulance carrying Moblin arrived at the trauma center, the medical team worked frantically. But the damage was catastrophic. The bullet had done its work with brutal efficiency. The following day, amidst the sterile beep of monitors and the hush of the hospital wing, Jadon Moblin would succumb to his injuries. The transition from assault to murder was legally complete. The narrative of a post-prom fight had ended. The narrative of a homicide investigation had begun. Gilbert's escape was underway. He moved through the darkness of the Texas highways, leaving the wreckage of families and futures in his wake. The silence of the road offered him a chance to reflect, to understand the magnitude of the 55-year sentence he had effectively signed for himself the moment he pulled the trigger. But reflection was not on his agenda. As the distance from Godley increased, so did his detachment from reality. He was not thinking about Jadon Moblin. He was thinking about his image, his reputation, and the warped validation he sought from an online audience. The phone in his pocket, soon to be used as an instrument of his own incrimination, was ready. Or the stage had shifted from a living room in Godley to the digital expanse of Instagram, where the final, grotesque act of his flight would play out. The shooting was over, but the performance was just beginning. As the distance from Godley increased, the adrenaline that fueled the shooting did not dissipate into fear or regret. Instead, it hardened into a disturbing form of bravado. The darker the highway became, and the more comfortable Spencer Gilbert seemed to grow with the reality of what he had just done. He was traveling south, putting miles of Texas pavement between himself and the chaos at the post-prom party, but he was not seeking obscurity. In a traditional flight from justice, the fugitive attempts to vanish. They discard identifying items, avoid surveillance, and sever ties with the world that knows them. Gilbert did the opposite. As the vehicle sped toward the Houston metropolitan area, he reached for his smartphone, turning the device that could track his location into a broadcasting platform for his crime. The journey from Godley to Houston covers approximately 250 miles, a drive that typically takes 4 hours through the heart of Texas. It is a route that transitions from the rural outskirts of the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex through the quiet stretches of rolling plains and eventually into the dense, humid concrete sprawl of the Gulf Coast. For most fugitives, this time is spent scanning rearview mirrors and monitoring police scanners. For Gilbert, it became an opportunity for performance. Somewhere along this corridor of asphalt, he opened Instagram. The decision to go live on social media while fleeing a homicide scene marks a specific and modern pathology in criminal behavior. It suggests a disconnect where the validation of an online audience outweighs the instinct for self-preservation. Gilbert initiated the live stream, and the screen filled with his image. The feed was not grainy or ambiguous. It was a clear, direct window into the cabin of his getaway vehicle. Viewers who tuned in were not met with a man panicked by the prospect of life in prison. They saw a 20-year-old man who appeared emboldened by the violence he had just inflicted. In the video, Gilbert was distinct and recognizable. The ambient light from the dashboard and the passing street lamps cast shifting shadows across his face, but his expression was readable. He was speaking to the camera, addressing an invisible audience of followers and friends, narrating the aftermath of a life-taking event as if it were a casual anecdote. The audio captured the drone of the vehicle's engine and the tires on the road, but Gilbert's voice cut through the background noise. He was not asking for help or claiming self-defense in a somber tone. He was bragging, and the specific content of the live stream dismantled any potential defense strategy regarding identity or intent. Gilbert did not merely allude to the altercation, he provided the visual confirmation of his role in it. During the broadcast, he produced the weapon. It was a semi-automatic handgun, the steel reflecting the artificial light of the car's interior. He held it up to the camera lens, turning it so the profile of the firearm was unmistakable. This was the same weapon that had discharged the rounds ending Jaden Maublin's life only hours earlier. By brandishing it on a public platform, Gilbert was effectively digitally tagging himself as an armed and dangerous suspect in real time. He smiled. The expression was congruent with the chilling mugshot that would later circulate in the media, a look devoid of the gravity of the situation. He handled the firearm with a familiarity that suggested pride. To the viewers watching the stream, the threat was palpable. This was not a reenactment, it was the immediate, raw aftermath of a murder, broadcast by the killer himself. The gun was still hot in the metaphorical sense, and Gilbert's demeanor suggested he felt untouchable, insulated by the metal of the car and the speed at which he was traveling. The psychological implications of this flex are profound. In the logic of the streets that Gilbert was projecting, the shooting was an accomplishment, a notch of credibility to be advertised. The escape to Houston was not a retreat, it was a victory lap. He discussed the shooting with a casualness that shocked investigators who later reviewed the footage. There was no mention of the tragedy of a young life lost at a celebration, no acknowledgement of the 50 witnesses left traumatized and godly. There was only Gilbert, the gun, and the screen. As he continued south, the digital footprint he was creating began to solidify the case against him before police had even located his physical position. Every minute the live stream remained active, it generated data. While he believed he was broadcasting to a closed circle of admirers or rivals, he was essentially broadcasting to law enforcement. The irony of the modern fugitive is that the desire for notoriety often accelerates their capture. So Gilbert's need to be seen and feared overrode the tactical necessity of staying hidden. The landscape outside the car window shifted from the open darkness of the rural counties to the brighter, more congested arteries of the Houston suburbs. The vastness of Houston often appeals to fugitives. Its sprawling neighborhoods and high population density offer a perceived camouflage. Gilbert likely believed that once he hit the city limits, he could disappear into the urban fabric. He could stash the car, hide the weapon, and lay low. But the live stream had compromised that possibility. By the time he reached the outskirts of the city, the digital evidence had already begun to circulate. The video did more than just place him with the weapon. It established his state of mind. Prosecutors look for evidence of remorse or panic to determine the nature of a sentencing recommendation. A suspect who calls 911 or who flees in tears presents a different profile than one who laughs into a camera lens while holding the murder weapon. Gilbert was curating his own prosecution exhibit. He was stripping away the possibility of claiming the shooting was an accident or a moment of blind panic. The calculated nature of the broadcast, unlocking the phone, opening the app, framing the shot, and delivering the monologue, required a level of cognitive function that argued against temporary insanity or sheer terror. But the drive eventually brought him into Fort Bend County on the southwest side of the Houston metro area. The fatigue of the 4-hour drive would typically set in for a driver, but the manic energy evident in the video suggested Gilbert was running on a heightened state of arousal. He was now hundreds of miles from the crime scene. The red and blue lights of the godly police were a distant memory, replaced by the humidity and traffic of the Gulf Coast. He likely felt he had successfully navigated the most dangerous part of the escape. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere remained charged. Gilbert's interaction with the phone continued to bridge the gap between his physical isolation and his social network. He was checking responses, perhaps gauging the street's reaction to the news of the shooting. This feedback loop creates a dangerous validation cycle for offenders. As likes and comments roll in, the reality of the 55-year prison sentence remains abstract, while the immediate gratification of digital notoriety is tangible. Gilbert was living in the immediate moment, fueled by the comments on his screen, oblivious to the fact that digital data does not vanish. The gun, now resting in his lap or on the seat beside him, was a physical tether to the crime. In the live stream, he had treated it as a trophy. In the eyes of the law, it was the primary link to the forensic evidence at the scene. Ballistics from the party in Godley would eventually match the barrel of the gun he was waving on Instagram. By keeping the weapon with him, rather than disposing of it in the hundreds of miles of open country he had passed, Gilbert was holding on to the very object that would seal his fate. It was a decision driven by ego rather than criminal prudence. As the skyline of the Houston area encroached, the reception of his cellular signal bounced from tower to tower, creating a breadcrumb trail that complemented the video evidence. Modern policing relies heavily on this electronic surveillance. While Gilbert drove, license plate readers, toll tag scanners, and cell tower triangulation were passive nets waiting to snag him. He had entered a major surveillance grid. The anonymity he sought in the big city was an illusion, and he was entering a zone where his vehicle could be tracked with far greater precision than in the rural counties he had left behind. The flex, the act of showing off the weapon and bragging, served as the psychological peak of his night. It was the crescendo of the violence that started at the post-prom party. But as the live stream ended and the phone screen went dark, the reality of his situation remained. He was a felon in possession of a firearm, driving a vehicle that was likely already flagged in state databases, carrying the weapon used in a homicide. The bravado displayed for the camera could not alter the mechanical and procedural response of law enforcement that was slowly grinding into motion. Gilbert navigated the surface streets of the Houston area, the false security of the escape settling in. He did not know that the intelligence sharing between agencies was already narrowing the search radius. The video he had posted was not just a fleeting moment on the internet. It was being preserved, analyzed, and used to build a profile of a suspect who was considered armed and extremely dangerous. The smile he flashed at the camera was about to be tested against the reality of a high-speed pursuit. The transition from the digital world back to the physical world is often jarring for such offenders. On Instagram, Gilbert controlled the narrative. He controlled the angle, the lighting, and the words. He could block dissenting voices and amplify his own ego. On the streets of Houston, he controlled nothing. He was subject to traffic laws, the mechanical limits of his vehicle, and the relentless pursuit of officers who had been alerted to his presence. The flex was a fantasy. The impending arrest was the reality. As he maneuvered through the traffic, the murder weapon remained in the car, a silent passenger that had been the star of his broadcast. The decision to keep it, much like the decision to stream, spoke to a mindset that prioritized image over freedom. He wanted the world to know he was the one who pulled the trigger, and he wanted the world to know he still had the gun. He had achieved that goal. The world knew, and because they knew, the net was closing in with a speed and intensity he had not anticipated during his arrogant monologue on the highway. The escape was nearing its termination point. The miles had been crossed, the video had been posted, and the confession had been digitally signed. Gilbert was now just a driver in a car in Houston, unaware that the eyes of the law were adjusting their focus, locking onto his coordinates. The silence of the car after the live stream ended was not peaceful. It was the heavy, pressurized silence before a collision. The journey that began with a gunshot in Godley was about to end with a crash in Houston. But the evidence created in the interim, the digital tape of his own confession, would survive long after the engine cooled. Confession had been broadcast, but the reality of the consequences was rushing up the pavement to meet him. As the miles of Texas highway blurred beneath the tires of his vehicle, the digital footprint Spencer Gilbert II had created began to solidify into a tangible cage. The Johnson County Sheriff's Office, on having identified Gilbert as the prime suspect in the shooting of Jaden Moblin, had already mobilized a multi-jurisdictional effort to locate him. The intelligence was precise. They knew his identity, they knew his vehicle, and thanks to his own need for digital validation, they knew his general direction and mindset. The investigation quickly pivoted from a crime scene analysis in Godley to a high-speed tracking operation spanning hundreds of miles south toward the sprawling metropolis of Houston. Law enforcement agencies rely on a matrix of data points to track a fugitive in real time, and on that Sunday afternoon the grid was lighting up. While Gilbert drove, likely believing he had put sufficient distance between himself and the chaotic scene at the post-prom party, as the communication lines between North Texas authorities and the Houston Police Department were already buzzing. The alert was priority status, a homicide suspect, considered armed and dangerous, likely in possession of the specific firearm he had just displayed to an online audience. The details of the vehicle were relayed to patrol units scattered across the Harris County area, turning every traffic camera and patrol car into a potential tripwire. On the transition from the open highways of rural Texas to the dense concrete arteries of Houston marked the beginning of the end game. It was late afternoon when the net tightened. Officers in Houston, primed by the Bolo alerts, spotted the suspect vehicle. It was indistinguishable from thousands of others on the road to the untrained eye, but to the officers scanning for the specific make, model, and tag number, it was a neon sign. The protocol for initiating a stop on a murder suspect is vastly different from a standard traffic violation. There is no casual approach, no assumption of compliance. The officers involved knew that the occupant had already allegedly taken a life less than 24 hours prior and had publicly exhibited a lack of remorse. They prepared for immediate escalation. As the patrol units maneuvered into position, closing the distance to confirm the license plate, the tension inside the police cruisers spiked. The confirmation came over the radio, a short, clipped verification that authorized the intervention. The emergency lights flickered on, a wash of red and blue cutting through the Sunday traffic, accompanied by the distinctive wail of sirens. For a brief second, there is always a pause where law enforcement waits to see if the subject will yield, if reason will override the instinct to flee. That moment passed almost instantly. So Gilbert did not pull over. Instead, the engine of his vehicle roared as he floored the accelerator, signaling his refusal to surrender. The chase that ensued tore through the streets of Houston, transforming the city's grid into a dangerous gauntlet. High-speed pursuits are among the most volatile situations in modern policing, balancing the urgent need to capture a violent offender against the catastrophic risk to the public. Gilbert drove with a desperation that disregarded the safety of the civilians around him. The vehicle wove through traffic, utilizing shoulders and aggressive lane changes to put distance between himself and the pursuing cruisers. The speedometer climbed, pushing the mechanical limits of the car as the convoy of police vehicles struggled to maintain visual contact while navigating the unpredictable flow of civilian drivers who were reacting slowly to the approaching chaos. Our radio traffic during the pursuit was a rapid-fire stream of location updates, direction changes, and speed estimates. Dispatchers worked to clear intersections ahead of the chase, attempting to create a corridor of safety, but the erratic nature of Gilbert's driving made prediction difficult. He took corners with reckless speed, the tires screaming against the asphalt as the suspension compressed under the lateral force. The pursuit moved from the wider, more forgiving lanes of the highway to the unforgiving constraints of surface streets, where the margin for error evaporated. Utility poles, parked cars, and pedestrians became sudden, lethal hazards. The psychology of a fugitive during such a flight is often characterized by tunnel vision, a hyper-focused state where the only objective is forward motion, regardless of the obstacles. Gilbert was running out of road and running out of options. The police strategy shifted from simple pursuit to containment, with units attempting to flank the suspect and deploy spike strips if the opportunity arose, though the speed and aggression of Gilbert's driving limited these tactical opportunities. The sirens created a deafening bubble of noise that traveled with the chase, a warning for anyone nearby to take cover. The inevitable conclusion of such reckless velocity is rarely a clean escape. As the chase intensified, the physical laws governing the vehicle began to assert themselves. Navigating a heavy vehicle at highway speeds through an urban environment requires precision that adrenaline often erodes. In a sudden, violent loss of control, the chase came to a crashing halt. Gilbert's vehicle, unable to hold its line during a maneuver, careened off the roadway. The metal crunched and glass shattered as the car slammed into a utility pole, the impact force absorbing the kinetic energy of the flight in a fraction of a second. The crash was catastrophic enough to disable the vehicle permanently. Steam and smoke began to hiss from the crumpled front end, and the airbags deployed, filling the cabin with white dust. For the pursuing officers, this was the most critical moment. A suspect who has just crashed is often disoriented, but also cornered and desperate. The cruisers screeched to a halt, forming a defensive perimeter, the officers spilling out with weapons drawn, using their doors for cover. They shouted commands, their voices cutting through the ringing aftermath of the collision. Gilbert, however, was not finished. Despite the severity of the impact, he scrambled out of the wreckage. The instinct for self-preservation that had driven him to flee the party and then the traffic stop now drove him to his feet. He bolted from the disabled car, attempting to flee on foot. It was a futile effort. The area was already swarming with law enforcement, and the physical toll of the crash likely hampered his speed. The foot pursuit was brief, a short burst of chaotic movement before officers closed the gap. He was tackled, the force of the arrest bringing him to the ground, ending the manhunt that had started hundreds of miles away in a godly field. As he was handcuffed and secured, the adrenaline of the chase began to dissipate, replaced by the methodical processing of a crime scene. Officers approached the crashed vehicle with caution, knowing the firearm mentioned in the investigation was likely still inside. A search of the interior confirmed the intelligence. Inside the wreckage, authorities recovered the handgun. It was a Glock, modified with a high-capacity drum magazine, the same distinct weapon that had been brandished with such arrogance on the livestream only hours before. The recovery of the weapon was a crucial piece of evidence, physically linking Gilbert to the shooting in Godley and corroborating the digital confession he had broadcasted to the world. The transition from fugitive to prisoner is stark. Gilbert was transported from the scene of the crash to the booking center, the reality of his situation beginning to settle in as the handcuffs remained locked around his wrists. The high-speed freedom he had fought for was replaced by the claustrophobic processing of the justice system. Fingerprints were taken, our personal effects were cataloged, and his background was run through the national databases, formally connecting the man in custody to the warrant for the murder of Jaden Moblin. It was during this processing phase that the final chilling image of the day was captured. When stood against the height chart for his mugshot, a moment where most suspects display fear, exhaustion, or stoicism, Spencer Gilbert II reacted differently. He looked into the camera lens and smiled. It was not a nervous grimace, but a distinct, upturned expression that seemed to defy the gravity of the charges he was facing. He had been captured after a manhunt, his car was wrapped around a pole, he was facing murder charges, and the weapon used to kill a 20-year-old peer was sitting in an evidence bag nearby. Yet the mugshot showed a man who appeared unbothered, a jarring contrast to the violence that had preceded the flash of the camera. The smile became a focal point for investigators and the public alike, a symbol of the disconnect between the perpetrator and the tragedy he had caused. It suggested a lack of comprehension regarding the decades of incarceration that now loomed over his future. The manhunt was over. The chase through Houston had ended in twisted metal and a foot pursuit, but the legal saga was only just beginning. Gilbert was securely in custody, the gun was off the street, and the smile that would haunt the case files was immortalized in the police database, marking the end of his flight and the beginning of his judgment. The smile that Spencer Orlando Gilbert II wore in his booking photo suggested a man entirely detached from the gravity of his situation, yet the physical and digital trail he left behind told a much starker, more incriminating story. While Gilbert projected nonchalance to the camera lens, forensic investigators were systematically dismantling any potential defense he might have mounted. The foundation of the state's case rested heavily on the firearm recovered from his crashed vehicle in Houston, a piece of evidence that would bridge the geographical gap between the chaotic scene in Godley and the termination of his flight from justice. Law enforcement officers secured the weapon found inside the wreckage of Gilbert's car, treating it as the primary biological and mechanical link to the murder of Jadon Moblin. The gun was carefully bagged and sent to the crime laboratory for ballistic testing. In the sterile environment of the lab, firearms examiners began the process of comparison. They test-fired the weapon into a water tank to retrieve an exemplar bullet and casing, preserving the unique microscopic markings left by the barrel's rifling and the firing pin. These striations served as a mechanical fingerprint, distinct to that specific firearm. Simultaneously, crime scene technicians in Godley had processed the site of the post-prom party. Amidst the discarded cups and the chaotic aftermath of the fleeing teenagers, they had located spent shell casings. Under the magnification of a comparison microscope, the examiners placed the test-fired casings from the recovered gun side by side with the evidence collected from the ground where Moblin had been shot. The result was a definitive match. The firing pin impressions and breech face marks aligned perfectly. This scientific confirmation eradicated any doubt regarding the weapon's involvement. It proved that the gun Gilbert possessed in Houston was, without question, the same weapon discharged at the party in Godley. However, the physical ballistics were only half of the equation. In the modern age of criminal investigation, digital footprints often provide the context that physical evidence lacks. Gilbert had not only fled the scene, he had broadcast his flight. Investigators turned their attention to the Instagram livestream Gilbert had initiated while on the run. This footage was not merely a glimpse into his mindset. It was a treasure trove of prosecutorial evidence. Digital forensic analysts scoured the archived footage, breaking it down frame by frame. In the video, Gilbert was seen driving, the adrenaline of the escape manifesting in a disturbing display of bravado. And he spoke directly to his audience, bragging about the shooting with a shocking lack of remorse. For the investigators, the audio was as damning as the video. His words constituted a voluntary, recorded confession, broadcast in real time. But the visual elements were equally critical. During the stream, Gilbert brandished a firearm. Analysts captured still images from the video feed, enlarging them to compare the weapon in his hand with the weapon recovered from the crash site. On the visual characteristics, the make, the model, the finish, matched the ballistic evidence. Furthermore, the metadata associated with the Instagram activity helped police construct a precise timeline of his movements. By triangulating the cellular data required to stream the video, authorities could map his route from Johnson County down to Harris County. The digital breadcrumbs corroborated the physical reality of the high-speed chase. The video showed him in the car. The police dash cams showed that same car evading arrest, and the crash site revealed the weapon he had held on screen. The convergence of these independent lines of evidence created an airtight narrative that placed the gun in his hand and the intent in his mind. While the forensic team solidified the legal case, the public was grappling with the emotional impact of the booking photo. The mugshot, released shortly after his processing into the Harris County Jail, became a lightning rod for community outrage. In the photograph, Gilbert looked directly at the camera with a wide, bright smile, an expression typically reserved for a school yearbook or a driver's license, not a murder charge. The image went viral, spreading across social media platforms and local news outlets, creating a visceral reaction among those who saw it. For the family and friends of Jaden Moblin, the image was a source of profound pain. It was interpreted as a final insult to the victim, a signal that the taking of a 20-year-old life meant nothing to the perpetrator. The juxtaposition was jarring. The somber reality of a funeral being planned for a young man killed at a celebration contrasted against the cheerful visage of the man accused of ending his life. The public commentary surrounding the photo was fierce. Online discussions fixated on the lack of empathy required to smile mere hours after allegedly killing a peer and crashing a vehicle during a police pursuit. The smile also affected the perception of the impending legal proceedings. In the court of public opinion, the expression stripped Gilbert of the presumption of an accidental discharge or a self-defense claim even before the details were fully known. It projected an image of malice and arrogance. Legal analysts noted that while a mugshot is not proof of guilt, it speaks to the character and demeanor of the defendant, factors that often weigh heavily during sentencing phases. The photograph suggested a defendant who was unrepentant, a narrative that the prosecution would undoubtedly reinforce with the video of him bragging on Instagram. The combination of the smiling mugshot and the bragging video painted a portrait of a specific type of offender, one who sought notoriety through violence. This was not a crime of passion followed by immediate regret. The evidence suggested a performative act of aggression. The forensic matching of the gun provided the how, but the digital evidence and the booking photo provided the who. They revealed a disconnect between the societal norms of guilt and Gilbert's internal reality. As the investigation transitioned from evidence gathering to case building, the weight of these elements began to press down. The defense would have to contend with a client who had effectively testified against himself on social media, possessed the murder weapon, and smirked while being booked for the crime. The smile that had so disturbed the public eventually became a symbol of the futility of his flight. It captured the moment before the reality of the forensic science caught up with his bravado, freezing in time the attitude of a young man who believed he was untouchable right up until the moment the cell door closed and the evidence lockers were sealed. The smile would remain in the public record, a chilling prelude to the decades of incarceration that lay ahead, framed permanently against the backdrop of the tragedy he had engineered in Godley. The smile that had so disturbed the public eventually began to fade as the reality of the Texas judicial system replaced the temporary high of internet notoriety. By the winter of 2023, the digital applause Spencer Orlando Gilbert II had sought on Instagram Live had been silenced, replaced by the sterile quiet of a jail cell and the mounting pressure of a case where the evidence was irrefutable. But the Johnson County District Attorney's Office had assembled a dossier that left little room for legal maneuvering. They possessed the murder weapon recovered from Gilbert's wrecked vehicle in Houston. They had the ballistics matching that weapon to the bullet that killed Jaden Moblin. Most damning of all, they had Gilbert's own voice and face, broadcast to the world, boasting of the violence he had just committed. The bravado of the fugitive run had evaporated, and leaving a 20-year-old defendant facing the potential of spending the rest of his natural life behind bars. As the court dates moved closer to a potential trial, the defense team was forced to confront the strategic impossibility of their position. In a typical murder case, defense attorneys might attack the chain of custody, question witness reliability, or argue self-defense. However, Gilbert's live stream acted as a digital confession, she effectively nullifying claims of innocence or mistaken identity. The footage showed a man not in fear for his life, but one reveling in the act of taking another. This distinct lack of remorse, captured in real time, presented a significant risk if the case went before a jury. A jury in Johnson County, presented with a defendant who smiled in his mugshot and bragged about the killing on social media, would likely show no leniency. The prosecution held all the leverage, and the conversation shifted from acquittal to damage control. Negotiations between the defense and the prosecution solidified in mid-December. The objective for the state was to secure a conviction that guaranteed the safety of the community and provided justice for Jaden Moblin and the other victims endangered at the Godly Party. For Gilbert, the objective was to avoid a life sentence without the possibility of parole or a jury verdict that could result in a de facto life term. If the agreement reached was substantial, reflecting the severity of the chaotic violence Gilbert had unleashed. He would not face a jury of his peers. Instead, he would stand before a judge and admit to the entirety of his actions. On December 19, 2023, the final chapter of the legal proceedings commenced in the 413th District Court of Johnson County, presiding under Judge William C. Bosworth, Jr. The atmosphere in the courtroom stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, noise-filled party in Godly, where the tragedy began 8 months prior. This was a place of procedure, order, and severe consequences. Gilbert appeared in court not as the boastful figure from the Instagram video, but as an inmate in county custody, stripped of the weapon and the vehicle that had facilitated his brief flight from justice. The smiling visage that had gone viral was absent, replaced by the somber countenance of a young man about to sign away his future. The proceedings moved with the swift efficiency of a plea hearing. Gilbert stood charged with multiple felonies, each carrying significant weight. The primary charge was the murder of Jaden Moblin, a first-degree felony in the state of Texas. Beyond the homicide, Gilbert faced 2 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, stemming from the danger he posed to others during the altercation at the post-prom gathering. Additionally, the court addressed the charge of unlawful possession of a firearm by a felon, a detail that underscored Gilbert's prior brushes with the law and his legal inability to possess the weapon he used to end Moblin's life. Judge Bosworth addressed the defendant, ensuring that Gilbert understood the rights he was waiving. The right to a trial by jury, the right to confront accusers, and the right to remain silent were all set aside in favor of the plea agreement. The judge's inquiries were standard but heavy with implication, confirming that the plea was voluntary and not the result of coercion. Gilbert affirmed his guilt. He admitted to shooting Jaden Moblin. He admitted to the assaults. He admitted to possessing the gun illegally. The admissions stripped the event of any remaining ambiguity. There was no longer an alleged shooter. There was only a confessed murderer. Following the acceptance of the guilty pleas, Judge Bosworth moved to sentencing. The deal brokered between the attorneys was presented to the bench for approval. In the Texas criminal justice system, judges have the discretion to reject plea bargains if they feel the punishment does not fit the crime. But in this instance, the recommended sentence was severe. Judge Bosworth delivered the sentence with the gravity the situation demanded. For the murder of Jaden Moblin, Spencer Orlando Gilbert II was sentenced to 55 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. The number 55 resonated through the courtroom. It was a sentence that mathematically spanned more than twice the length of time Gilbert had been alive. However, the 55-year term was not merely a number. It came with specific legal stipulations regarding parole eligibility that are unique to violent offenses in Texas. Under state law, specifically regarding 3G offenses, now found in Article 42, a .054 of the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, individuals convicted of murder and aggravated assault involving a deadly weapon must serve a substantial portion of their sentence before they can even be considered for release. Judge Bosworth's sentence meant that Gilbert was not eligible for the standard parole accumulation that applies to nonviolent drug or property crimes. There would be no early release for a good time in the traditional sense that could drastically reduce his stay. The law mandated that Gilbert serve exactly one half of his sentence, calendar time, before he could even file an application for parole. This stipulation locked him into a cell for a minimum of 27.5 years. The calendar became his adversary. Having been arrested in April 2023 and sentenced in December 2023, although the calculation for his eligibility date projected far into the mid-21st century. Spencer Gilbert would not be eligible to walk free until the year 2051. The courtroom dynamics during the sentencing highlighted the tragedy of the wasted potential and the permanent loss of life. While the defense had secured a cap on the sentence, preventing a potential 99-year or life term, the victory was hollow. Gilbert entered the system as a 20-year-old and would not see a parole board until he was nearly 50. The decades in between would be spent in a high-security environment, a stark departure from the fleeting notoriety of his live stream. The sentence also addressed the additional charges. The counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and unlawful possession of a firearm ran concurrently, absorbed into the massive 55-year block of time, and ensuring that the murder charge remained the primary driver of his incarceration. The judgment delivered by Judge Bosworth served as the official societal condemnation of the act. It dismantled the narrative Gilbert had attempted to construct in the hours after the shooting. On the drive to Houston, while streaming to his followers, Gilbert had framed the shooting as an act of dominance, a moment of power. The judgment reframed it as an act of destruction that ruined 2 lives, Jaden Moblin's, which was ended abruptly, and Gilbert's own, which was now confined to the regimented existence of the penal system. The smile in the mugshot, which had been an affront to the victim's family and the community, was legally erased by the grim finality of the prison term. As the hearing concluded, the reality of the 55-year sentence settled in. Custody of Gilbert was transferred from the Johnson County Sheriff's Office to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He was processed out of the local jail, where he had sat since the end of the high-speed chase, and prepared for transport to a state assessment unit. There, he would be classified and assigned to a specific prison unit to begin serving his time. The post-prom party in Godley, intended to be a celebration of youth and the future, had ultimately resulted in a future canceled for one young man and a future paused indefinitely for another. The legal resolution also brought a measure of closure to the Moblin family, though the sentence could never restore what was taken. The plea deal spared them the trauma of a graphic trial. They did not have to sit in the gallery and watch the live stream of their loved one's killer bragging about the deed. They did not have to endure cross-examinations or the viewing of crime scene photography. And the guilty plea was a vindication of the facts they already knew. Jaden was an innocent victim of senseless gun violence. The 55-year sentence ensured that the person responsible would remain removed from society for generations. By the time the court adjourned on that Tuesday in December, the case of the smiling killer had reached its legal termination. The media interest that had spiked due to the sensational nature of the Instagram video and the mugshot had largely dissipated, and leaving only the dry ink of the court records. Spencer Gilbert was handcuffed and led away, no longer a viral sensation, but inmate number 02-485-300, or the eventual designation assigned by TDCJ. The bravado was gone. The audience had moved on. All that remained was time, decades of it, stretching out toward a distant date in 2051. The transition was absolute, from a young man brandishing a weapon for likes to a prisoner aging behind concrete walls, the smile long since extinguished by the judgment of the court.